Hello, everybody. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share with you on a topic that receives very little attention and yet has such a devastating influence on so many people's lives, and that is the destructive power of emotional abuse. So let's begin with a definition. Emotional abuse is any non-physical pattern of behavior designed to exert power and control by undermining the victim's emotional security and or psychological stability. Now, most emotionally abusive relationships begin with a grooming process. Grooming is a term that we often associate with child abuse, but adults can be groomed too. Grooming is simply a pattern of behavior that is designed to increase opportunities for abuse. In Psalm 55, verse 21, David says of his enemy that his speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. So emotional abusers are often very charming. They lull their victims into a false sense of security before they reveal who they really are. Now, many victims of emotional abuse don't recognize just how abusive their relationships are. While many forms of emotional abuse are obvious, right, shouting, name calling, criticizing, there are also many subtle forms of abuse. Manipulation, playing mind games. So sometimes victims of emotional abuse don't recognize it for what it is. And it's important that they are exposed to healthy relationships so that they can distinguish between the healthy and the unhealthy. Victims of emotional abuse don't tend to come to church with cuts and bruises. They come with bruised and broken hearts. And again, the words of the psalmist are applicable here. He says of his enemies, or the impact of his enemies, that I am broken by their taunts, flat on my face, reduced to nothing. And that is reflective of the experience of many who go through emotional abuse. Now, abuse in all of its forms are about power and control, including emotional abuse. And yet Jesus says to his disciples, Matthew 20, verse 25, you know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, yet it shall not be so among you. Jesus makes it very clear that force, power and control, coercion should never be a part of any Christian relationship. Now, abusers will systematically cause their victims to develop an unhealthy dependence on them. They will do their best to keep them away from sources of support, either friends or family. They will so undermine their self-confidence that they don't trust their own judgment. And if they can't trust their own judgment, who are they going to trust? They then have to place their reliance on the abuser themselves. And so there is a process of undermining an individual's sense of independence. Healthy relationships, however, cannot exist without the freedom to exercise individuality and autonomy. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 17, now the Lord is the Spirit. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So any relationship that seeks to curtail an individual's independence, their ability to make free choices, is an unhealthy relationship. Now, the most frequent form of emotional abuse is verbal abuse. That is the intentional use of words to attack, bully, blame, insult, demean, mock, undermine, deceive, embarrass, or hurt. Now, words have power. Solomon says in Proverbs 18 and verse 21 that death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. So Solomon is not playing games with words here. We can destroy people with our words as much as we can build them up with our words. James 3:6, the tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and it's itself set on fire by hell. Now, again, James uses some very serious words here, and his words are backed up by modern day research, which shows that harsh words can have the same physiological impact on a victim as physical violence. And so, while as seriously as we take physical domestic violence within the church, we should also treat emotional abuse in the same way because it has just as much of an impact, if not more. Now, there are many, many forms of verbal abuse, and we don't have the time to go through them all. But it's important to recognize that many of these forms of communication, while they may not be abusive in and of themselves, they become so when they are part of a pattern of coercive control. Emotionally abusive or emotional abuse is often characterized by reactive abuse. When we get into stressful situations, um, conflicts, heated arguments, adrenaline floods into the system, and that causes a fight or flight response. Now, when that happens, it often impairs the proper functioning of the prefrontal cortex, where we make rational judgments. And as a result, we can say things or do things that we wouldn't ordinarily do when we are calm. Now, reactive abuse often occurs when individuals lack the skills of emotional regulation. And so one of the things that we can do to help couples who are in abusive relationships is to teach emotional awareness and emotional intelligence. Because when people know how to regulate their emotions, they can prevent some of the more reactive forms of communication. Proverbs 15, verse 18, a hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. Now, part of the problem with abusive relationships is that often there is not a willingness on the part of the perpetrator to actually get the help that they need. And many times they will use emotions like anger as part of their system of power and control. Emotional abuse is also characterized by deceit in many cases. Emotional abusers tend to lie so easily that it becomes second nature. The Bible tells us that, the devil is the father of lies, and that it is his native tongue. And when abusers lie, they practice to lie, it becomes part and parcel of what they do. The psalmist again reflects the character of the liar. He says his mouth is full of lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under his tongue. Now, abusers often portray themselves in public as opposite of the way their partners experience them at home. They are the wolves in sheep's clothing. John Bunyan's character, Talkative, in his book, The Pilgrim's Progress, is described as a saint abroad, but a devil at home. Solomon says, he who hates disguises it with his lips and lays up deceit within himself. When he speaks kindly, do not believe him, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. A very insidious form of emotional abuse is gaslighting. Now, this term comes from a 1944 movie where the main character, a guy, marries a woman in order to deceive her. He's trying to get control of her property, and when they move into the house that she owns, he begins a process of trying to drive her insane and get her committed into an asylum. And one of the ways he does it is to to turn down the lights in the house that were lit by gas and then turn it back up again. And when she notices this, she brings it to his attention, and he says to her, no, 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 you're just imagining things. And hence the term gaslighting. So gaslighting is any psychological manipulation that seeks to cause a person to doubt their own memory, their perception, and their sanity. Blaming and accusing is another characteristic of emotionally abusive relationships. And we see this in the Garden of Eden, where Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the serpent, and then there is this implied blame on the part of Adam, where he says to God, the woman who you gave me. So if you didn't give me an effective woman, everything will be fine. So to abusers, the blame for any problems always rests with a source outside of themselves. And most of the time that will be with the victim of their emotional abuse. We see this in the beginning of the Bible and in the book of Revelation at the end of God's word. The devil is described as the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night. And so this is a primary characteristic of abusive relationships. Now, in overcoming emotional abuse, it's important for victims of emotional abuse to appreciate that biblically loving someone does not require the toleration of their abuse. Any healthy relationship requires healthy boundaries. Jesus himself exercised healthy boundaries. We read in Matthew 16, verse 23, but he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men." Now, Jesus would have known that his words would have hurt Peter emotionally, and yet it was important for Jesus to let Peter know that he was allowing the enemy to influence him. And Jesus was very boundaried in order to protect his values, to protect himself. And it's important that victims of emotional abuse learn how to set effective boundaries, especially in their intimate relationships. Now, it's important for victims of emotional abuse to recognize abuse when it occurs and be willing to ask for change. So change occurs by recognizing abuse and setting boundaries. And in asking for change, it is also important for victims of emotional abuse to be careful. Now, while there may not have been any physical violence in the relationship up to the point where they start setting these healthy boundaries, it is possible that things can escalate. Emotional abusers can become violent if they feel that the relationship is at risk. And this is a characteristic that we see in abusive relationships. If we think in terms of the children of Israel's experience when they were in Egypt, when Moses raised the possibility that the people were going to leave, what did Pharaoh do? He upped the ante. He made their experience a lot more difficult in order to crush their spirit. And so we should not be surprised in emotionally abusive relationships that the perpetrators of emotional abuse will up the ante in order to try to discourage the victim of emotional abuse from leaving that relationship. And that can, in some instances, be an escalation to physical threats and physical violence. So it's important for victims of emotional abuse to have a safety plan so that they can think through how they will be able to exit a relationship if that becomes necessary. And the formation of a safety plan is best done with somebody who has some knowledge and expertise in these areas. So survivors of emotional abuse need to clarify and reinforce their boundaries by challenging every incidence of abuse. So first of all, they need to know what they want. You can't set boundaries unless you first know what those boundaries are. And so it's important to think through, what are the values I want to live my life by? And then begin to communicate those very clearly. Now, in setting boundaries, boundaries without a consequence are not boundaries. So a victim of abuse can say, if you do so and such, then I will. But if they don't actually follow through with those threats, then those boundaries are useless. And so with every boundary that is set, there needs to be a consequence, so that the perpetrator of the abuse realizes that they can't get away scot-free with their abusive behavior. So it's important for victims of emotional abuse to challenge every incidence of abuse. Don't just focus on whatever the subject of the dispute is, but actually challenge the underpinning abuse, a zero tolerance attitude. It is important for victims of emotional abuse to realize that they cannot save their abusers. Oftentimes, victims of emotional abuse will feel that they have this responsibility to rescue the abuser from their abusive characteristics or nature. But I love this quote. It says, "You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm." So victims of emotional abuse need to exercise a high level of self-care and realize that allowing themselves to be a victim of their emotional abuse is not a virtuous trait. What research indicates is that the more submissive a victim becomes, the more emboldened an abuser becomes. So oftentimes what a victim of emotional abuse believes will be the solution to the problem actually becomes the problem itself. Just to go back for a moment, this is especially the case with those who believe in a very hierarchical marriage, for example, who believe in the concept of submission, or a distorted concept of submission, where maybe the husband is the head of the house and the wife needs to be subservient. The victim of emotional abuse who embraces this mindset and believes that they have to put up with all kinds of abuse in order to save the victim, have a misconception of what a relationship should be like, because they do have this responsibility to look after themselves. And if they make themselves subservient to the abuser, they can actually be compounding the problem, because what emotional abusers need is accountability. We'll come to that in just a short while. So there comes a point in an abusive relationship where the victim has to say, you know what, enough is enough. The psalmist says, "My soul has dwelt too long with one who hates peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war." So survivors of abuse need to appreciate that even Jesus couldn't make everyone happy. You know, if they feel that they have this mission to save their spouse, they may be mistaken, because you can't save everybody. So it's important for them to exercise this high level of self-care and self-preservation, especially if there are children within the home as well. So loving someone unconditionally is not synonymous with having an unconditional relationship with them. And this is characterized by the relationship between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness is something we should always strive for, not only because it benefits the other person, but actually forgiveness benefits the forgiver most of all, because it involves the releasing or allowing God to remove destructive emotions from our hearts, and allowing us to heal and giving us the capacity for reconciliation through the power of his spirit. But reconciliation is dependent on the right behavior on the part of the other party. So if the relationship is one that threatens the spiritual, emotional, or even physical safety of the victim, then reconciliation may not be the thing to do. Only when you see that the perpetrator of abuse is taking steps to change, and you see real change, then reconciliation may be warranted. So survivors of abuse need to reach out for help. They need to appreciate they don't have to do it alone. Solomon says, the prudent see danger and take refuge. Victims of emotional abuse oftentimes have been so downtrodden, sometimes for years, that their sense of personhood has been violated. Um, Oftentimes, they will remain in abusive relationships because they do not have the emotional energy to reach out. Sometimes they don't feel that they are worthy of anything better than what they have. But it's important that they do take courage, and it does take real courage to reach out to somebody that they trust and to communicate what is going on in their lives, because oftentimes these relationships are characterized by a high level of shame. But it's important for survivors of abuse to look for, reach out for the help that they need. Now, what abusers need is accountability. Holding perpetrators of abuse accountable for their choices is an act of love, and it can be the catalyst for repentance. We see this with David, where Nathan points to him and says to him, "You are the man." And immediately when David sees himself as he is, he repents. And Nathan assures him that he is forgiven and that he will not die. And so holding abusers accountable for their actions can actually result in their repentance from their abuse. In Matthew 18, we have a process that we can follow. But it's important to appreciate that in Matthew 18, this is a redemptive process. At every stage, we're seeking to bring the individual in line with good biblical principle. But in Matthew 18, verse 15, it says, "But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector." And so Matthew 18 highlights the need for accountability and consequences for intransigence. So let's begin to summarize. Options for survivors. Get professional counseling support. This is vital for victims of emotional abuse to reach out. And oftentimes, because of the long-term impact of emotional abuse, counseling support can be effective in helping them to heal. Build a support network. It's important to connect with friends, family, support groups, so that the victim of emotional abuse can get a different perspective on who they are than the one the perpetrator tries to foist upon them. They need to practice self-care, exercise, proper diet, engage in personal interests, do the things that make their hearts sing. And in this way, they can build their sense of self-worth and self-acceptance. They need to appreciate, again, that they cannot fix the abuser, and that their primary responsibility is their own safety and the safety of any children that may be in the house. So they need to separate from the abuse. They can ask their spouse to go to counseling with them. Now, while in physically abusive relationships, couple counseling is contraindicated. it's too dangerous for the victim of abuse, because they are hardly going to open their hearts in a counseling session if they know they have to go home and probably bear the consequences of what they share because of the physical threat. But in a situation where there is emotional abuse with no threat of physical violence, if they can get their spouse to go with them to counseling, they can possibly learn the skills that will help them to regulate emotions in a way that can offset the emotional abuse. Now, if the spouse is unwilling to go to counseling, that is their choice. We cannot force them, but the victim of abuse should go anyway for their own benefit, for their own healing. Victims of emotional abuse can educate themselves about what a healthy relationship should be. Read books, watch videos on YouTube, attend seminars, do whatever they need to do in order to get a proper view of what healthy relationships are. And that links with what we said before about building a support network of friends and families so they can experience healthy relationship. Then we mentioned the setting of healthy boundaries, and that this requires courage on the part of the victim of emotional abuse, but they need to press through the discomfort, because they're beginning to act in a way that they haven't done beforehand. It is not their default way of operation, and yet they need to learn new ways of relating in order to hold the perpetrator accountable and facilitate change. Because when an individual in a relationship becomes more healthy, it places the perpetrator in a situation where they have to make a choice. Either they adapt to this new, healthy, self-confident, boundaried person, or they will try and up the ante, and in some instances they may even separate and go and find somebody else to abuse. And again, we mentioned this, asking for change, and when change is requested, it needs to be done in a way that is specific. So victims of emotional abuse need to ask themselves, what will be different when things are happening in the way they should be happening? Because oftentimes the perpetrator of abuse may not know what they need to do. For example, if a wife says to her husband, you need to be more loving, he might not know what that looks like. And so there needs to be very specific things that are communicated. These are the things I want you to do. This is what I want to see. So then the perpetrator has an opportunity to actually do something specific. And then number 9, be aware that leaving any abusive situation is an option. It is important for victims of emotional abuse to know that they don't have to remain in an abusive situation that is destroying their spiritual, emotional, and potentially their physical well-being. Let's leave you with this passage from the book of Ezekiel, which communicates God's desire for us. He says, I will send down showers in season. There will be showers of blessing. They will know that I am the Lord when I break the bars of their yoke and rescue them from the hand of those who enslave them. They will live in safety, and no one will make them afraid. I hope and pray that what I've shared here will be a benefit to you and will help you as you seek to help those suffering from emotional abuse. God bless you.